Now we finally move on to episode 19, and there are a few things with this episode. In particular, some are very good depiction, some they took some creative liberty, some not entirely accurate, but there's one thing that has nothing to do with culture that just doesn't make any sense in terms of realism. And we're just gonna go through all of them. We start out by finding out that what we were preparing was a medium-sized ritual or ceremony. So there's a difference between different levels of ceremony. As we discovered before, there were specific ceremonial wear made for different scale and different size ceremony, and it depends on the size and rank of the ceremony. Large ceremonies generally were to, say, honor ancestors, the heaven, or something bigger. Medium-sized ceremonies were usually to honor things like minor deities, seasons, stars, mountains, the 4 pillars of the country, essentially. So those were medium-sized ceremonies. And that made a little bit more sense given Jinshi's position, because large ceremonies generally would have been hosted by the emperor. Given that he's not the emperor, he might be in charge of hosting medium-sized ceremony because they're more numerous and they're not as important. So you get your brother to do it when you don't have enough time to do so. We get this tie-in between the mysteries in a few episodes, discussion between the military officer and Mao Mao. Now, the reason behind him being so scared of Jinshi actually discovering him, partly because Jinshi's reaction and face, and partly also, you're not supposed to do that, even without a court. You're in a court, right? You're on your job, and from outside perspective, you're not really doing your job properly if you're just chatting with girls all the time. So that's not something that you should do. And if you're discovered, like anyone being discovered by higher management, you'd be kind of embarrassed, nervous, surprised, and yeah, that's not something that you usually do. Especially in traditional societies such as ancient China, that's definitely something you didn't do. And we were talking about reward for Mao Mao, mentioned by Jinshi, for solving the mystery, which is the ox bezoars. And they're essentially gallstone of oxen, and they are used for traditional medicine in China. If you imagine gallstones forming, and if you imagine that amongst ox, those are very rare. So much so that in order to keep up with demand, they actually had ways to make artificial ones, which they actually weren't the same quality as natural ones. So what they came up with was, rather than artificial ones, they also had cultured ones that are grown in a lab in similar environment to like an ox's gallbladder. And what's kind of funny and a waste is that in the West, in slaughterhouses, these are usually thrown away. Kind of like the Asian carp situation we have in North America, whereas these things were high in demand in Asia. So there's no one that thinks about utilizing this, because these are quite pricey and rare, and they potentially will be sold for a very high price, and you're just throwing it away. So that seems like a waste. And when Mao Mao's looking through the mystery, she actually came across one schematics of the essentially altar for the ceremony. They've shown the schematics. It's actually based on the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. The only thing is they actually added 2 more layers to this Temple of Heaven. Temple of Heaven has 3 rooftops, whereas this one has 5. So creative liberty, that's totally acceptable to make it a little bit more different. What is less acceptable, once again, was what I mentioned in the last episode as well. The hat that Jinshi is wearing, in particular, has 12 beads on each side, which you're not supposed to use unless if you are the emperor. Like, if you're acting on behalf of Emperor, even if you're doing that, you're not supposed to use that. You could potentially use a 9-beaded one, but not 12 beads. But once again, as I discussed last episode, since most image search will show the 12-beaded one, unless if you know about the culture enough, then you wouldn't know that this is the wrong number of beads to use. But they are animators in Japan. I don't suppose they actually gone to that deep of a research when animating. Although the creative liberty taken with the Temple of Heaven and adding 2 more layers, that's totally acceptable and normal. The fact that they actually position it inside the Imperial Palace, it's somewhat less accurate, because the real Temple of Heaven wasn't in the Imperial Palace. It wasn't even in the inner city in old Beijing. Nowadays, this location inside the whole city of Beijing is pretty much the city center, and it's not that far away, but in ancient times, inner city was only so big, and this one was located outside of the inner city. In the last dynasty, they built an outer city, and this was included inside the outer city, but still, it's not inside the inner city. And besides the Temple of Heaven, there's also Temple of Earth, Temple of Sun and Moon. All other 3 temples were all located outside the city. These kind of ceremonies were to honor essentially nature, so you don't want them to be located inside a more or less man-made and made-up structure. So they wouldn't be inside the Forbidden City for sure. But in the show, they are, I guess, for travel distance. Imagine her having to run outside of the Imperial Palace, which she couldn't do on her own. That just basically stops the story. So, whatever it is, it didn't follow tradition, but they had to place it inside the Imperial Palace. And then we've come across with this scene that doesn't make any sense physiologically, which is how Mama was dealing with the guard and how the guard hit her. If you look closely enough, the guard is holding what's essentially a bar mace. And traditionally, these kind of things were battlefield weapons that could also be used as a ceremonial guard weapon. As a battlefield weapon, these things were supposed to be used to hit opponents with helmets on. So they were supposed to damage people with helmets and essentially kill them with the helmet on. And this guard, in particular, Mao Mao is shown in statistics as about 5 feet or 1.50 meters tall and just tiny little girl. This guard is 6.5, like 190 and above by comparison. A guard this size, and particularly like a military officer swinging something like this against an armored opponent will most likely kill them. Him swinging this against Mao Mao, it would have just split her skull in half or taken the top half of her head off. Like, it makes no sense that she could get up. Like, her brain will be mush, her face will be caved in. The amount of damage we saw was pretty bad, but it's not as bad as what reality would have suggested. Once again, this basically makes me prefer one of the manga depiction rather than the other. They went with one depiction showing the guard hitting her with the club thing or bar mace, whereas the other one just shows the guard punching her. Like, a punch is enough to give this kind of damage that we saw in the show. And it took her a while to get up. If she was actually hit on the head with a bar mace, she'd be dead instantaneously. There's no way that she's not dead, unless if her skull is made of adamantium like Wolverine. So, like, it makes no physical sense. You could argue that for the other version of manga, the club might be made of wood, so she might be okay because it's a wooden club. But for the anime, at least, they've shown like a metal club. So that just makes no sense. However, I can understand why. Mediums such as anime or any kind of drama or show has grossly overestimated human body's like integrity. We've seen people walk away with gunshot wounds. We've seen people like take multiple cuts and just blunt force trauma and still get up and going. That, if it's just a punch to the face, it didn't seem grave enough. But in reality, you won't be able to get up. Like, this thing would have killed you. It would have killed like anyone if you're hit on the head with it. If you don't believe me, then buy a piece of ham with bone in it, get a metallic bar mace, hit it yourself with it, see what kind of damage that does to like a ham leg. And usually, hams are firmer than head, skull, or face, so that wouldn't be the damage this thing does to a person. So that's a big issue, but it's not an issue with this show alone. It's just that people's assumption with the kind of damage that you get from weapons has been grossly misrepresented. So much so that people don't really understand what weapons could do to a person anymore. Also, for the version of manga where Mama was punched in the face, actually mentioned Lacan's specific position inside government, which is essentially chief of staff of the army, which ranks him in the same rank as the prime minister and chief prosecutor. Now, there are 3 positions that are held the highest just below the emperor. When I say chief prosecutor, it's actually not a prosecutor of regular criminal cases and laws. This chief prosecutor's whole job was to audit and prosecute any government official, essentially. So you have head of bureaucracy, and then you have head of government, and essentially what Lacan's position in this version of manga is the head of army. And that just makes the scene make much more sense why the guard is so deadly afraid of him and take his word for it, because he's essentially the head of the army. Whereas in the novel, he's just mentioned as strategist, which a strategist is not an official title, and it doesn't really show any rank or in particular position. We've actually seen Mao Mao running inside the temple, actually going through a layer, and essentially it just shows that this building in the show is actually double layer. There's an inner room you kind of have to go around to get inside. It just means that this building is much bigger than the building this is based on. So it also makes sense of why they added 2 more layers to this. Because in reality, the Temple of Heaven, although the whole area temple complex is quite big, the actual building of the Temple of Heaven is a single layered building. It just has an outer wall, and then once you go inside, there's no inner room. It just has 1 layer of wall, and then inside is the altar. Whereas in the show, you kind of see 2 layers. Last bit, we're shown with Junshi having the dragon emblem on his chest. Since he's acting on behalf of the emperor, it makes more sense for him to use that symbol. Also, the fact that he's part of the imperial house, that just makes it official. However, it depends on the rank you have in the imperial house. If you're just the emperor's brother, your dragon might have to be different from the emperor's dragon. Emperor's dragons have 5 fingers on their claws, and generally if you're emperor's brother, you'll be 1 rank lower. Your dragon might only be allowed 4 fingers on your claws. But we see 5 fingers on this dragon, but since he's acting on behalf of the emperor, in this case it's more acceptable, unlike the hat we've mentioned. And as he's carrying Mao Mao away to most likely seek medical attention, I think other people have mentioned it as well. It's quite a slow walk. They kind of want to elevate the scene a little bit, so that's why they show him walking slowly. In the novel and in the manga, both depiction, it showed him walking much faster than this. Essentially running, because it is an emergency. She had a cut on her leg as well. Which, in reality, and which would have made more sense, was the actual injury that's more damaging and more grave to her. Whatever she took to the head, that might temporarily just disorient and incapacitate her a little bit, that wasn't shown to have nearly as much damage. Once again suggesting that a punch would have been enough, and the hit on the head with bar mace doesn't make any sense. That's just gonna kill her. That aside, we're gonna have to see where the story goes from here, because now we have a assassination plot, and potentially we have to figure out who did that and what's gonna happen to it. Because we are dealing with an attempt on a royal family's life, and potentially even a plot against the emperor, because you don't know who's hosting the ceremony. May as well be the emperor.